This video is sponsored by Skull Bliss. So I thought it was time for a fireplace makeover. Let's hope my wife doesn't mind. Okay, so here's a quick cross section of the mantle. This is a prototype I made. The blocking in here may change, but overall the shape of this is how it's going to be. You have a top, then a flat panel, another shelf, and then basically kind of a flat crown molding that bevels into the firebox. Now the material I'm going to be using is something called HDF, high density fiberboard. You can see here it's about 1/8 of an inch layer on each side with a plywood core. But just like MDF, it's super smooth and takes paint really well. And with that, we can head over to the table saw and start ripping our material into strips. And rip we shall. We actually need several different widths for this because we have the outer shell and then the panel and then the inner shell. All right, so I quickly realized as I was laying out all my parts on a sheet of paper that I was going to be a little short of material. I only had 1.5 sheets and I really needed 2 full sheets. So what that means is there's going to be a couple seams, which is a real kick in the ass. But I think I can hide those pretty well. And this is for my house, and I was literally just rearranging these stacks for dramatic effect. I need everything back over here. I'm gonna start cutting some 45s to make a sandwich for the top and the edging, and then also the sides of the mantle. Yeah, that looks about right. Now the outer shell of this mantle is 1.5 inches thick, so I need to laminate 2 pieces of this HDF plywood together to give me that thickness. To do that, I'm spreading around some glue, and then I roll it for a nice even film thickness, fold them on top of each other, and then I use a square just to make sure those bevels line up perfectly, and then some brad nails to secure it, and then some screws to really secure it. That way I don't need any clamps. And as you can see, since I didn't have enough material to go full width on the double thickness on the sides, I'm just doing the front and then filling in some blocks on the top and bottom. Now I'm going to make the actual little returns or filler strips to fill in that wedge or that 45-degree slot all the way around to give me a continuous finished edge and completely fool everybody that this is actually 1.5 inches thick, when in fact it is not. And just to make sure my wedge fits in nice and snug, I plane off that sharp corner so it can slide in and no glue pooling attempts to push it out. And with some glue and some brad nails, I secure that in place, and as you can see, it's basically like a little book fold. Now, if you recall, which I hope you do because it was literally 94 seconds ago, I said I didn't have enough material to go long enough on one side of the mantle as well as one piece of crown. So I'm joining 2 pieces together. I'm using the Festool Domino to do this. And since this has the MDF skin, usually you can join 2 flat pieces together, sand it down, and you'll never see the seam. And I can attest to the fact that after this is all painted, you'll never be able to tell. So with all my slots cut, I can add some dominoes and some glue and join these 2 pieces together. And because these are such long pieces, I'm actually adding clamps in the middle to make sure that their joint doesn't flex up. You can see there that it was flexing up, and these clamps bring it down nice and flat. And we can let those dry overnight while Lola and Jerry monitor the clamping pressure. Isn't she a cutie? And once everything was dry, I could start cutting the miters to build the outer part of the frame for this mantle. And I'll tell you right now, this was a real pain in my backside. My saw was just a little bit off, and when something is just a little bit off, it compounds and compounds, and I could not get that angle perfect the way I wanted. The joint was not fitting tight. So what happened was that piece kept getting smaller and smaller. You'll see later the repercussions of that. And when I say smaller, it was only about 3/16 of an inch, but it completely threw off my design idea for how the mantle was going to hit the floor and the hearth. We'll get to all that later. But in the meantime, I'm dominoing all these miters. And as you can see, son of a bitch. Well, luckily this is paint grade, so I can fill that and sand it, and you'll never know. Now I'm using a little ruler square thingy to establish my layout line for where I want my ledger backer to sit. This will give me a nice solid backing to secure the recessed panel to. And I also want to point out right here that, yeah, I screwed up. I put my dominoes in the wrong spot, filled them, and redid them. And I gotta tell you, I don't do paint grade projects very often, but it is nice to be able to just glue, brad nail, or screw and fill those holes and paint over them without having to worry about hiding everything. It's a nice little woodworking vacation for me. Pocket holes. Yes, pocket holes. Now, the pocket holes in this ledger board are going to allow me to screw into my recessed panel and not have to nail through the front of it. Nice. Now, more pocket screws in these little corner braces. That'll help me keep my corners nice and square and secure. And now I had a decision to make. And after an extensive and heated debate with Lola, I decided to just flip a coin. We decided all, yep, time to glue this whole thing up, I guess. And Jerry decided that he would oversee this part of the build. So with glue and dominoes, I started the process. And the reason I debated on this is because I knew once this thing was together, it was going to be very large and hard to move around my shop. So I wanted to make sure that I had done everything I could while it was in pieces before actually securing everything together. And those dominoes really make these miters so much easier to come together in alignment. You don't have to worry about anything slipping out of place. The most important thing is that your layout is done properly and that they are cut in the right spot. And with that first corner done, I could move on to the other corner using the same process. Dominoes, glue.
And I'm realizing now, probably shouldn't have glued this up yet, because I'm gonna have to scribe the sides to the floor, the bottom.
It only makes it infinitely harder, if not impossible. Well, that's installation Keith's problem, isn't it? Let's just stick with fabrication Keith right now, and we'll get through this. So, with clamps in both directions, we could get this thing secure. Nice squeeze out in the corners, got some clamping squares in there, and that's a pretty nice tight miter. And to ensure that it stays nice and tight, I'm just adding these little clamping blocks in the corner here to make sure when I move this thing around, nothing wants to pull apart or get janky on me. Oh! Dang it, Jerry. You're gonna give me a heart attack, my man. Now, for some reason, when I glued up that other longer panel because it was too short, I didn't do this one at the same time, so I'm doing that now. Same process, dominoes, glue, clamps, Dunsky. Ooh, iron-on edge banding. Now, this may not be clicking in your brains just quite yet. Well, hang on, let me stop right there, because I know you're going to ask, where did I get that little iron? It was from Woodcraft years ago. They don't sell it anymore, unfortunately. Okay, back to my other point. Okay, so for most of you, there's going to be a moment of clarity where you're going to say to yourself, Keith, you're gluing on edge banding, and then you're going to be putting this on a fireplace surround that's going to have a ton of heat. Isn't this going to eventually peel off? Well, I have a confession to make. This project actually started last April, which was 14 months ago. 14 months ago. Are you done laughing? Okay. So I had built this part of the mantle and temporarily put it on the fireplace, and things went on hold, and we went through the whole winter where we used this fireplace every single day and on the weekends all day long, and nothing. It did not peel. It didn't show any signs of coming off. So really, that's why this build took so long, is I wanted to conduct extensive field research on this iron-on edge banding. And as you can see, it was a success. And I did it all for you, just to answer the burning question that you were going to have. Okay, and while all that was going on, what's happening here is I'm cutting the miters on the inner part of the mantle, just like the outside, which had miters. The next level in also has those miters. And now I'll start ripping some 1x of primed pine for that recessed panel, as well as a few pieces to use as my backer board to screw that recessed panel into. So to make sure that it stays nice and straight and on my layout line, I pop a brad nail in, and then a screw, and a brad nail and a screw, brad nail, brad nail, brad nails, and then screws to secure it so I don't need clamps. Now, I'm 6'2" with a decent wingspan, but I really needed to stretch to get this one up. And it's actually a lot heavier than it looks. At least, that's what I'm going to tell you. But as you can see, the frame is really starting to come together on that part. Now, to maintain the structural integrity of the recessed panel U-shaped thing as I move it, I just screwed on this little stretcher, and that will keep everything in place as I move it from over there to over here. And I can get some glue spread and then carefully hoist it into place And actually, this is one by MDF primed. I, for some reason, thought it was pine, but it's primed MDF. So after I pocket screwed, you can see I sanded the corners nice and flush. And then it drops in as though I actually took correct measurements. So that's nice to see. And then with some clamps, I can pull it tight to the outer shell of the mantle itself before pocket screwing it to it. Well, first I needed to spread my wings and lift this thing up so I could actually access the pocket holes from underneath. And once access was granted, it was a pocket hole frenzy, or pocket screw frenzy in this case. The holes were already frenzied. And then back down. And I'm not sure what I was eating there, but I apologize for chewing. That's kind of rude. Next up, I needed to take a measurement from one end to the other so I could put one of those support stretchers on the bottom, just like I did when I was moving the frame over. And this got a little tricky with only 2 hands. Getting it just right and in place, and then securing it on the other side. And double checking my measurement, confirming that it matches the measurement I took up top. Then secure it with the clamp and some screws. Now we could start putting in our inner frame. Hopefully the construction of this is starting to become a little more clear now. I have my inner border, and that pseudo recessed panel is sitting on the ledger of this inside frame. I just tap that into place to get that miter in the corner, being careful not to hammer it too much and breaking that edge. And then I can clamp them securely in place and take a measurement for the inner piece. Oh, I'm chewing gum. That's what I'm eating. I apologize.
Am I crazy, or is that a lot of gum?
It's a lot of gum!
It is a lot of gum, Lloyd, and you're not crazy. Okay, with measurement in hand, it was over to the miter saw to cut this to final length, putting a miter on the other end, even though I'm hiding what I'm doing, so I don't really know what's happening behind there. Okay, with cut made, it was back to the mantle, which I had to weasel my way in to get inside, and I could drop this in and hopefully it fit. And with a little tap on that side to get it nice and tight, I can confirm we were good. But to double confirm, I clamped the top piece into place and then tapped the other side in to make sure I had a nice tight miter in the corner, and that looks pretty good. Oh. Okay, with my inner border or frame pieces mitered, I could now cut some dominoes for those. Now these will be plunging all the way through. I was aware of this just because of the length of the domino that I was going to be using, and since you'll never see that blowout. So with some dominoes in place and spreading around a little bit of glue, we could get these glued up. And then I can use a corner clamping square to make sure it is square, and then a big clamp to pull that miter tight, and I had pre-drilled some holes for some screws. So I'll drive those home from both sides and make sure this miter stays nice and tight. I repeat the same process in the other corner. Dominoes, screws, clamp, and done. And then I could finally join these pieces together. So with some more pocket screws from the inside, from this ledger board into that recessed panel, I now have a large picture frame, well, 3-sided picture frame, essentially. Wow. That's when I made the phone call to my buddy Zach from Dettmore Home Improvements to do the tile. And there he is. And if you don't know Zach, he's a highly acclaimed builder, carpenter, and remodeler and home builder out of New York, New Jersey metro area. And he was kind enough to come all the way out to the country to help me with this tile job because I've never done tile before and I had no interest in learning how, never mind on a herringbone pattern for the first time. And with the old stone facade out of the way, Zach began by cutting up some delicious fiberboard underlayment using his grinder and probably a diamond wheel and a vacuum. Look how neat he is. Even we're outside and he's trying to control the dust. So with those pieces cut, we could bring them back inside and with some construction adhesive, stick them to the wall and then add some screws of some kind to really secure them. Now the plan was to use some Schluter aluminum bead, but unfortunately they didn't have the thickness that we needed for the tile and the board, etc. So we bought some aluminum L-channel and then I classed it up by spraying it with some black spray paint, some high heat black spray paint that is, and then cut it on the miter saw and mitered it so it could fit in and hide that fiberboard edge very nicely. It was also the perfect thickness to hide the edge of the tile as it went all the way around. See, we kind of had a plan here. Then it was template time. So Zach made his little template out of some Luan and a hot glue gun or some kind of adhesive there. And then he started his layout in the driveway. while I filmed everything and watched him do it. Laid his template down on top and then traced out where he needed to cut. Now this was a little difficult because it didn't fit exactly centered. So what we had on each side was almost like a little teeny corner. So we had to off-center it a little bit so one side had no corner and the other side had a bigger corner that wouldn't break off. And then Mr. Conscientious labeled each sheet so we knew exactly where to install it when we brought the tile back inside. I love it. And so much for dust control on this operation. Then it was time to apply some mastic or adhesive, and Zach is using a 1/8 by 1/8 by 1/16 flat top V-notch trowel. How about that? I had to write that down. I didn't actually remember that. I wrote it down so I could give you the proper information. And then he just worked his way around, each one following his numbers that he had written on the tile. A little more mastic, a little more tile, a little more mastic, a little more tile. And I guess that hard float helps push the tile down nice and level so there are no high spots. And there's a little bit of fine tuning there. And I guess Zach was using a mastic that was very fast set, so there was no need to put any spacers as the tiles were not sliding and moving around. And then it was the fun part of filling in all these little teeny triangles, every tile setter's dream, I'm sure. And once all those teeny tiny pieces were in, it was time for Jerry and Lola to help with the grout. Unfortunately, their little paws had a hard time gripping the float, so Zach had to do all the work. And we're using this Mapei Ultracolor Plus FA. It's some kind of hybrid grout. Picked this up at Lowe's. The color is white. So Zach worked that all in, all around. And then with a wet sponge, cleaned up all the haze and excess grout and smiled for the camera. Once all the residue was cleaned, a quick buffing gave it a nice little shine using a microfiber cloth. And that just about did it for Zach. So don't forget, go follow him on Instagram where he gives out a ton of tips for builders and contractors and business owners, and his YouTube channel where he does the same. All right, so I've reached a little design sticking point. As you can see here, the mantle overlaps this hearth by about 1/8 of an inch. And that is because when I was cutting these miters, I couldn't get them exactly right, so the top piece kept getting smaller and smaller until I ended up with this. And I have the same problem on the other side. So there are two options here. I can notch this so it drops down. I still have to notch this piece of trim here. Or I can take a piece of the stone that we took down before we replaced it with the tile, cut it and slide it under here. That way the hearth kind of continues around and back. Spoiler alert, I did decide to cut a piece of stone and slide it underneath. But first, I need to remove this part of the trim work, which proved to be quite a bear. This was solid oak and construction adhesive, and it took a little while. Now, I did have some reservations about this, but ultimately I decided to go with it. And if you want to leave a comment below, I'd love to hear what you think would have been the best solution here. And it doesn't have to be one of these two, because I did have another one in mind. And then it was my turn to use the grinder. So I'm using a thin diamond blade on my right angle grinder. And I know it doesn't look like it, but I am wearing a mask when I'm cutting this. And I see Jerry couldn't keep his nose out of my business while I was outside checking my work. As you can see, I got some U-shaped plastic shims under there to help build up and keep that piece of stone nice and flat. Then I'm just using some extra strength construction adhesive to build a nice little mortar bed here, and then set the stone down on top, check for level, and then we'll let that sit overnight. I put a little kettlebell on top just to make sure it didn't move on me. Now it was time to cut the legs of the mantle to their final length. I left them a little bit long because I wasn't sure the spacing of the tile, how it was all going to work out. So now that I know my spacing left to right, I'm going to match that from the top of the firebox to the bottom of the mantle itself. So with those measurements written down, 11 3/4, 14 7/8, which means I need to take off 3 1/8 of an inch to the miter saw. Well, first, let's lift this thing out of the way and bring it out to the shop and show you how I did this. It wasn't exactly the most well choreographed operation. It was a little tall, it was a little heavy, and a little awkward. Now the real kicker here was I knew my miter saw wasn't going to be able to make this cut all the way through. So I'm gonna have to make one pass and then with the track saw, get the other side. Always fun lining up two cuts from two different saws. I also wanted to make sure I wasn't putting any undue stress on those miter joints since this thing was now standing straight up and could pinch down a little bit. So I cut a spacer to put in between, and then I could make my first cut and begin the cartwheel mantle gymnastics here to get this thing spun around and back into position to cut the other side. And then when that was done, I could wrestle this thing to the ground, flip it somewhat upright, and then carry it over to where I could attack it with the track saw. And this ended up working out quite well, actually. Next up was the inner flat crown, which is basically a piece of flat stock that will be placed at a 45-degree angle inside the frame. But here's the rub. Since this is a crown molding, the spring angle is 45 degrees because I have a 45-degree cut on each side. Now, this is too tall to cut on the miter saw stood up like you would normally cut a crown molding, so it needs to be cut on the flat. And when you cut crown molding on the flat, it needs to be bevel cut and a miter cut. And to figure out what these angles are, there's a handy dandy chart that's been made by somebody much smarter than I am. And here's where I got my correct angles for these cuts. So it's a 35-degree miter with a 30-degree bevel. Now, to widen and kind of thicken up that inside beveled edge that's going to butt up against the tile, I'm just adding some prime pine here using some glue. My original plan was to go with a thicker piece here, but I wanted as much of the tile to show as possible. So with that glued on, and I can trim it off, and then I can actually glue this thing together. Now, I'm going to use the lamello on this one because it's such an awkward and large glue up. The Clamex connectors, which have the cam in it with an Allen wrench, are really going to help me close this thing up and allow me to put glue in there and then drive screws home and really secure that joint. So, like I said, Clamex connectors in. Here's some glue. Use the Allen key and tighten those down and then screw everything nice and tight. Now, on the other side, things didn't go quite as smoothly when I was sinking the screws.
Bridge abutment!
But all is not lost. I backed out the screw, cleaned up the infected wound, and then used some Bondo to patch it up. Then it was time to get some primer on everything. This is BenMoore Aqua Lock. So, using a roller, just applying it to the inside crown here. I also did it to the other part of the mantle, and then I could bring it inside and see what needs to be scribed and confirm whether my initial scribing fears did come true. And in this case, it was off, probably 3/16 of an inch on the top and a little bit on the side. So, I took to scribing. Now, one of the issues here was the interior part of this frame is on the same plane as the outer portion. Now, I didn't want to scribe both of those because that would have taken forever. So what I decided to do was clamp on a straight edge on the inside and then flush trim a 1/4 inch off of that, which produced a dust storm like no other. But it had to be done. And where I couldn't get in the corners, I actually just finished those up with a handsaw. Then I brought it back inside, and somehow I forgot to film actually scribing the outer part of this frame, so I just used a belt sander and then sanded up to my line. Once I got it in, it wasn't exactly perfect and tight to the wall everywhere. There was about a 1/16 gap, and admittedly, I just got a little bit lazy. And I realized at this point I hadn't really figured out a way to secure this thing to the wall. So I screwed in a cleat and drilled for some pocket holes and then secured the cleat to the wall and then pocket screwed up into the mantle. I did it on the top as well as in the bottom corners. Now, I would have loved to have broken out my HVLP and sprayed this thing nice and clean, but I really don't have the ventilation or the setup to do that indoors. So I gotta do it by brush and by roller. Now, a little trick here that I use is I am taping some parchment paper on, which will allow me to paint freely and anywhere and be messy as I want, and then at the end I can just slip that out. I've used wax paper in the past, but tape doesn't really stick to that. Doesn't really stick to parchment paper that well either, but a little bit better. Then I run a bead of caulking all the way around where that crown molding is going to hit, which will seal that joint and secure it to the mantle. And speaking of that crown, here it comes. Let's hope it fits. And luckily it did. So with everything lined up, I could secure it with some 16 gauge nails, or 18 gauge, 16 gauge nails here and there. Not too many, just want to secure it. No need to pepper it full of holes like Swiss cheese, because that just means more nail holes to fill. So once everything was secure, I ran a bead of caulk around everywhere, make sure that was, then using a wet rag to make sure I got any slop out of there, making sure it's nice and neat. And at the end of the day, I filled those nail holes, and the next day I could get those sanded and reprimed and then start painting. But before I could do that, I had a couple pieces of trim to fit back in. These little buggers were a little bit of a challenge getting them slid in there, but threw some caulk in there and then clean it up nice and tidy. I had to put that little shoe molding in there too. And then it was finally painting time. This is BenMoore Scuff X in satin and the color is super white. And I'll be honest, after seeing the mantle with that gray primer, I really liked that, and the white turned out to be very bright, but that's okay. I like it bright and airy, but who knows? We'll let this marinate for a little while. If we want to change the color, it's easy enough to do. So the technique I used here was I rolled on where I could, and then I just came back and tipped it with a brush. Then I had to paint the walls. Now the accent wall directly above the fireplace is called Cobblestone Path by BenMoore, and the walls are Paper White by BenMoore. So I learned this little trick from my buddy Bourbon Moth, is once the final coat was on the fireplace, I taped everything off and then came back and painted over it again to seal that paint line. Then I could come back with my wall color and it would not bleed through the tape because it was sealed by the paint below. So stand by for a minute and I'll show you how that worked out. And while that was drying, it was the perfect time for me and Lola to take down all that parchment paper. So now we could see how the mantle looked with that beautiful new Carrara herringbone tile. And I think I forgot to mention that that tile cost me $300. Now for the walls, I did the same painting trick that I did on the mantle by taping off and then sealing it with the other color. And then I could come back and paint that accent wall above the fireplace. And it was at this point I realized that the coaxial cable connection and that outlet were still probably going to show when I hung the mirror up. I should have moved them. In any event, the next day I could peel back my tape and see how my paint lines look. Not too bad, a little jagged down the bottom there, but relatively crisp all the way around. So definitely a cool technique to keep a nice crisp paint line. And then the last detail was to hang the mirror. Now this is some round mirror with a walnut frame from IKEA. And you've probably seen this trick before, but to get the holes exactly where you need them on the wall, I'm just using some green tape and then marking out where the little hangers are. And then over at the wall, leveling it off, marking it, drilling for some anchors, and then hanging it. Oh, and cleaning off my fingerprints, of course. Well, there we go. Not bad for 14 months. What do you think, Jer? Check it out. So yes, it did take a while, but ultimately my wife likes it. I think we got what we wanted. We're going for that more modern look, bright. The tile looks great with the herringbone. Zach did an awesome job with that. And now I can turn the fireplace off because, well, tomorrow's July, so it's a little warm in here.